Thank you all for coming this afternoon. I'm Carolyn Putney. I'm the Chief Curator here at the Toledo Museum of Art, and we're thrilled to have you all with us today. I am going to be introducing our speakers, Frank Soretto and Jung Lee. Thank you for being here. And they are going to be talking to us about predicting success in college using graph building skills, which I'm very interested in. And before turning it over to them, I just want to make a few clerical notes. The session will run for about an hour and maybe a few minutes for questions and answers at the end. And if anybody wants to get coffee, we still have a couple minutes. And then the nearest restrooms are out in the hall, take a right, then go to the Matisse, take a left, and they're on either side. Well, they're all ladies here, they're on the left-hand side. So, in the event of a fire alarm, our room steward, Pam Davis, will tell us how to get out most safely. And if you have any questions at all, please ask me or Pam. And if you could turn your cell phones to mute to avoid interrupting our speakers, we'd really appreciate it. Thanks for being here, and please give me a hand in welcoming our two presenters.
Thank you. So, there is a baby tour going on, right?
Yes.
Sounds so interesting, but you decide not to go there. And there is another thing, the keynote speaking is going on too. You know, who wrote and drew his dissertation in comic book forms. Sounds very interesting. But you decide not to go there, and you choose here. So who are you? We feel really heavy about this presentation. You gave up all those things and you are still here. So let's kind of introduce us. I'm Jung Lee from Stockton College of New Jersey. Let's start over there.
Hi, Cheryl Buckland. I'm an MSN student at Lord's University from Finley, Ohio.
I'm Susie Short. I'm retired from education, being a classroom teacher and an administrator after 30 years in December, but started to work immediately thereafter. And so now I work for the ESC of Lake Erie West as the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning.
I'm Katie Sweet, and I'm actually a classroom teacher. I'm Penny Achayo. I'm a research associate in visual communication design from the University of Notre Dame.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. If this presentation is not what you think, feel free to go to keynote speaker. We are not offended. Actually, I want to go to baby.
We were hoping no one would come, right?
Actually, we are very pleased that our audience outnumbered us.
Yes.
So this is kind of research-oriented presentation. We are thinking about this study is about student constructed graph things, and there's a lot of research about student ability to interpret graphs. They didn't interpret well, but after training they did better, or that kind of study. But we didn't see much about student construction of graph. So that was our focus. And also in college, there's a lot of emphasis on this construction, the higher order thinking skills, and understanding. So this graph construction is become, we believe, more important. Actually, the previous session we went was data visualization. That was also awesome presentation.
Yeah, who was at that data visualization? Yeah. And I took a couple of notes on the session, and I thought that there were two, these are quasi-quotes, depending on whether I can read my handwriting or not, but there were two comments that were made that I thought directly relate to our presentation, and one of them was made by Christina Noren, and again, this is not a direct quote, but she essentially said that the promise for the future is that ordinary people can not only consume data visualization, but also create them. And again, that's directly related to what we're trying to study and trying to understand. And then Ray Cha later said that the most important challenge at this point is to help people select appropriate data visualization. So you notice it's not just about consumption, it's about selection and production.
So in this graph construction ability, we divided by 5 areas, 5 aspects. One is when the student construct a graph, we thought about these 5 elements. The one is type, the selection of type of graph, not only pie chart, maybe other bar chart, line chart, stacked bar chart. So select the right type of graph, most appropriate for specific purpose, and then labels, what's the x-axis, what is y, what is the title, that kind of labels, and scale, select appropriate scales, and then correct the representation of data, and then explanation, why they use this graph to answer the questions. So we divide by these 5 areas when we evaluate student graph. So maybe somebody said, then is this 5, are those 5 dimensions actually measure student graph abilities? After we conducted the research, when we analyzed the data, it seems like it shows moderate to strong pairwise correlationship was found between 5-dimension graph construction abilities. So among these 5, if somebody, in other words, if somebody did well in one dimension, that student did well for other dimensions. If somebody did not well in one dimension, one of the dimensions, then the student did not well in other parts. So it's pretty highly correlated. And also, when we measure that 5 dimensions with other, like SAT math ability, SAT critical reading ability, SAT writing ability, we compare those things with these 5 dimensions. There is a weak or non-significant pairwise correlation found, which means this 5 dimension is separate from SAT math or SAT critical reading or SAT writing. That was our previous research. So, and then we are thinking, then these 5-dimension abilities can be a predictor of success in college. Since we said that SAT, those things separate from these 5 dimensions, we try to measure whether then this graph ability, like making appropriate type, choosing appropriate type of graph and interpret correct data, all those things, maybe it's a separate ability. So it may measure, we thought maybe this one is math ability, writing ability, visual ability together, so we may measure student college success. That was our hypothesis. So we implemented our study in our school, Public Liberal Arts College in Northeast United States. Phase 1, we used 67 new students enrolled in the pre-summer programs designed to improve math and verbal skills in 2011. And then it's more like a longitudinal study. After we collect data at that time, and then after 2 years later, 4 semesters later, we make a correlation, whether there is any relationship with student GPA, and then their graph ability skills. Okay, so in phase 1, students were given data and then ruler and protractor. It's not in technology. They used really old-fashioned graph skills, and then 3 graphing tasks. For each task, they were asked to draw a graph and to answer specifications about the data, and then use the graph to answer the questions. Here's the actual. And then after they draw the graph, student graph was scored by 2 independent readers using a rubrics. And then this is the data we give, areas and populations from 1953 major countries. And then this is the instruction. So please draw the graphs as accurate and as clearly as possible. And then this is the graph 1 task. Suppose you wanted to compare the population of 3 countries in the year 2000. Then 2, or suppose you want to examine what portion of total area of North America is occupied by each of the 3 countries. And then the third one is, suppose you wanted to determine which of the 3 countries had the fastest rate of population growth from this one. So 3 tasks, and they are supposed to draw 3 tasks. And then for each task, 1, 2, 3, student papers were evaluated with 5 dimensions, like I explained before. Whether they choose appropriate graph, how about the quality and completeness of the label, and then collect of scales, they made the right scales, and accuracy of accurate construction skills, and collect and completeness of the answer to the question. For teachers, it seems pretty simple, but let's see. So we gave scores between 1 to 4, and then when there is a discrepancy more than 1 point, we talk, and then us just a problem. And some scores were used for analysis. Okay, here, from this, these are.
So, as Jung said, we essentially were trying to do 2 things. We were, first of all, in the first study in 2011, trying to determine whether this ability to make a graph is a distinct academic skill from other supposedly measurable academic skills, like SATs and so on. And then once it appeared as though this was a distinct skill, then the second question is, well, to what extent might it help us predict student success in college? We use these other measures. They've been validated as being valid predictors of success in college. So, as Jung said, the first study was done 2011, and then we tracked the students who were still there 2 years later. And but what I want to share with you first is just some of the sample responses we got in 2011. Now, the first question, where the student was asked to compare several things, we expected that the most appropriate graph there would be a bar graph. For the second question, we expected the most appropriate graph would be a pie chart, because we were asking for parts of a whole. And for the third graph, where we were looking for trend analysis, we were expecting some kind of line graphs as the most appropriate. So let's see how the students did. And again, these are students who had been accepted to college. They were enrolled in a summer program designed to enhance their skills, but they did represent, although they sort of were representing the lower end of the spectrum, there were still some students who had pretty good SAT scores and so on. And so here's a sample response where you can see again the student drew some bar graphs as we had expected and hoped, and this was kind of a good answer. I mean, this is good. This is what we hope to see. You can see here very clearly the student used some fair scale here, so we have pretty much, considering it was done by hand, pretty much a fair representation. Then For the second question, again, here's a student who, as we had hoped and expected, did a pie chart, right, where you can see what portion of the area was Mexico's and so on, and you get a visual sense of the fact that gee, Mexico doesn't really have that much area compared to most of the other countries. And again, as we had expected for the third question, we see 3 line graphs here showing us this trend analysis where one can easily see which country had the, well, maybe not easily, but where one can draw inferences about which country might have had the fastest growth rate.
This is pretty good one, even you see these labels.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and these were good responses, and they were expected responses. But I thought it would be also useful to show you some other responses. So we had some surprise responses. I like to call them surprise responses. So this was the way one student handled the comparison, which was really very interesting, wasn't it? Instead of using bar graphs. Remember, we gave no instructions about how to do this. We just gave them the task. And so this student used some coding and provided a legend here and presented this one-dimensional representation, which was unexpected. We had some other surprises that were different. And in this case, you can see a student, instead of taking the traditional approach of having all of these sectors touch the center of the circle, the student decided to be a little more creative in terms of that. But maybe still had a sense that relative area was the most important feature. So unexpected, interesting. There's another one, which I think does not do as good of a job, frankly, of showing the relative sizes. You know, this area is considerably larger than it ought to be, but again, it was unexpected. So I think, I'll show you this more before I make any summary comments about it. Here's another one. And I guess we could argue maybe our instructions weren't clear enough, because we had asked for the relative areas of these 3 countries, not in comparison with the rest of the planet, but that's what this student did. So, okay. Again,
What's it?
the rest of the countries. Yeah, exactly. So, there are no other countries in America, but anyway, but this wasn't a geography course, one could argue. Okay, so, here's another one, which really sort of stumped us a little bit. But yeah, I'll just let you think about that for a bit. Then here's, this was the one about the fastest population growth. And this student apparently aggregated all 3 countries somehow, and then looked at overall, I'm guessing, looked at overall population growth. Well, let me back up. And I think this taught us something very important, and that is that there are so many skills and understandings that we take for granted. Now, these are entering college students. Some of them in our follow-up study are doing quite well in various majors and various studies. You know, they're bright young people, and they've gone through an educational, K-12 educational system where we make assumptions about what they can and cannot do, and I think this reminds us that we should be very careful about making those assumptions. That in fact, it sort of relates to the next question: to what extent do we give practice students for creating graphs as opposed to just interpreting them? And to what extent do we provide them with meaningful feedback on a regular basis so that they can really build that skill? And again, keep in mind these comments that we expect that the future will be all about being able to create as well as consume these visuals. Yeah. So, okay, so that was from part 1, phase 1. Then, of course, what did we do? Well, 4 semesters later, we said, well, let's take a look at how these students have been doing. And so we collected 4 semester grade point averages, and we used some regression analysis to take a look at these various predictors, the traditional ones like math SAT, critical reading SAT, writing SAT, and then this new construct we call graph construction ability or skill. Let's see how well they work as predictors of GPA. And again, this is just the variables we used. This is not really that exciting. We calculated mean scores for each question and all that sort of thing. We did some tests to determine that the validity of the way we were doing the data analysis was sound, and so on. I won't get into the details of the statistical tests and so on. And just some general background. You can see here some means and standard deviations of these various measures. Now, just again, to give you a context, this mean is relatively low in comparison with the mean of the college. The mean of the college in 2011 was I'm guessing, was probably in the low 500s. Okay? So as you can see, this group is a little bit lower than average on average, but as you know, it doesn't speak to every student in the cohort. Similarly for the other measures. And you'll notice the mean GPA was 2.77.
May I ask a question?
Sure, absolutely.
What is algebra 13.9?
Yes, I'm sorry, I sort of overlooked that. We, in addition to these 3 variables, which are the sort of traditional predictors of success, we also gave 2 years prior an elementary algebra and a reading comprehension test. And I sort of glossed that over because we didn't follow up with that in the phase 2 of the study. But yeah, they were other tests that were given. Now, sorry. This shows, again, this is actually tracking the students who persisted for 2 years. And so this is just a reminder of how they did 2 years earlier on this test. Remember, the maximum values were 8, so these scores vary from 2 to 8 theoretically. And so you can see, generally speaking, they did test on question 1, which is the one they called for a bar graph, which kind of did not surprise us. Not so well with question 2, relatively speaking, which was the one that we expected would be a pie chart, and sort of in the middle for the one that we expected one. This is just the mean of those curves, so basically gives us a sense that on average a student scored 5.2 out of 8. And then you'll notice in terms of these dimensions that we invented, where we tried to sort of deconstruct what does graph building skill mean, you'll see that, in fact, most students were able to select an appropriate graph. That's what type is all about. Labels, you know, pretty good, not as good here. Scales, lousy. So students really have a lot of difficulty understanding what an appropriate and fair scale is on the axes. Accuracy, they did well. They were able to plot points fairly accurately. Their explanations, which again required them to use the graph that they had constructed to answer the question. So which country had the fastest growth rate? Well, we wanted to hear that. So this was really a combination of graphic skill, mathematical skill, and writing skill. And you can see here, certainly sort of middle of the road, not great. Okay, so this is just basically the same thing in visual. So again, you can see question 1, students did relatively speaking well. By dimension, type well, accuracy well, others not so much. Now, then for question 2, which is how well did these various measures correlate with GPA? You can see here that none of the correlations were very high, which is kind of interesting, right? Because we have so much faith in these other predictors, don't we? I also want you to notice, though, that the overall question mean score had not a statistically significantly higher, but a higher correlation than any of these other measures with 2-year GPA, which we admit is not the only measure of success in college, but it is one. So this was kind of interesting. So then what we did was we said, okay, well, gee, that's kind of encouraging, right? But maybe we're onto something here. Maybe this is a hidden predictor or some lurking variable. And you can see here, though, they were all, the correlations were all statistically significant. And again, none of them that high. So what we did next was regression analysis. And essentially, with regression analysis, there are many ways to do regression analysis. We did what's called hierarchical, which means you start with one variable as a predictor, and then you try to add the others one at a time. And if the addition of a new variable improves the predictability, you add it to the model. If it doesn't, you throw it out. And you keep doing that until you run out of independent variables. And what we found, and normally you start with the one that has the highest correlation. And we did that, and we found out that we were not able to add any of the other variables. In other words, when you look at graph construction alone as a predictor, it's not improved at all by adding on math SAT, verbal, critical reading SAT. They add nothing to it. That's sort of the interesting good news. The bad news, this R square is really low. And R square, just for the record, is a number from 0 to 1, and it basically describes what percent of the variation in the dependent variable, in this case GPA, is explained by your model. Right? So in heaven, it's 100%. On earth, it never is. Right? But we hope for higher R squares than that. So this is basically saying this model explains about 9% of how GPA varies. Not a lot. But better than any of the other. So that's essentially what part 2 of the study showed us, that this graph building ability seems to be at least as good a predictor as the other ones that we kind of take for granted. But it really doesn't. There's a lot more going on. There are many other variables that must be explaining differences in GPA. And again, to some extent, that's no surprise. Questions?
Just step aside just a second, I'll read your last sentence. I'm trying to have everything sink in that you just
Sure.
said, but it's a fascinating study.
Yeah. But did you want me to repeat something?
No.
You sure?
Yep, no,
Okay.
I got it, you did a good job.
Well, thank you.
Statistics
Thank you.
is not always very easy to
Well,
follow. You did a
yeah,
nice
and
job.
again, please feel free to ask
No, you
for
did.
any other clarifications. Yeah. But you have another comment or question?
Is there a stronger correlation between any of the measures? I know you didn't do the graph construction with the students who were admitted without the stipulation that they come to the summer camp.
No,
So-
and so
Right.
that is one of, in fact, let me
Okay.
get to that when we discuss limitations, and that's a serious one. This is essentially what I just said a few minutes ago, that graph construction ability seems to be as effective for predictor of GPA as the traditional ones, but it's still not great. Now, before we get to limitations, though, some implications.
Yeah.
So what does this study tell us? Well, the first study that we did back when we collected data in 2011 suggests that we cannot infer graphing ability from math or verbal ability, that it seems to be a distinctive ability. And now if you think about that, that has implications for the classroom, doesn't it? So, you know, we place students into math classes according to their math scores, right? You often. Okay, but then you've got a classroom filled with students that scored high on some kind of a math test. Probably in that same group you have students who are really good at building graphs and really lousy at building graphs. And yet, if I were the instructor, I would assume that they're all probably pretty good because they did pretty well on the math placement test, right? So we need to be very careful about the assumptions we make. Now, limitations, yes. Very serious limitation. The generalizability, that is to say, as I said before, this group of students is not typical of students at Stockton College, where the study was done, and it's certainly not necessarily representative of all college students. In order to give the inferences we draw from the study more validity, we need to do some replications, right? We need to do the study in other places to see if the same thing happens. And that is, you're right, it's absolutely a serious limitation. There were also some issues, Jung didn't talk about them, but You do remember she mentioned that we independently scored these, and then we had these negotiation sessions, in which if there was a discrepancy of more than 1 point, we would discuss, and then we would each present our opinion, and hopefully through some arm twisting and some other things, we would reach consensus, and we did. However, we, and please chime in if what I say now is not your recollection, but mine is that even after that negotiation process, we still felt a little uncomfortable about the rubric that we had developed and used. Is that fair to say? Yeah. So along the way, we thought, maybe we might want to, if we do this again, and when we do this again, we might want to refine that rubric to make the scoring more reliable. Now, so where does that leave us? Well, certainly the idea to just do this over and over again in different contexts and different situations to see if in fact the results are confirmed. That's certainly one area. But there are other outcomes as well, right? GPA is just one outcome. What about retention? It's a biggie for colleges and universities these days. Very, very important. And then what are the other correlates of graph construction? One of the things that we thought of, I think it's fair to say after the fact, which we should have thought of first, is we made the implicit assumption to start with graph construction, only because we saw all of this research on graph interpretation, but virtually nothing on graph building. So, we would say, okay, let's start there. This is an area that's ripe for study. But what we didn't do, and we will do when we do the study again, is to give the same group of students not only a graph construction set of tasks, but also a graph interpretation set of tasks. Because for all we know, they are highly correlated, and frankly, it's a lot harder to evaluate graph construction than it is graph interpretation, or you can imagine multiple choice tests and things. And so maybe we're kind of spinning our wheels here and coming up with this thing, which is sort of, in an academic sense, interesting, but practically speaking, maybe not as valuable as just looking at graph interpretation. If graph interpretation and construction correlate, then why, let's just measure graph interpretation, it's easy. EPS can do it. So that's another area. And of course, there are others. We didn't study students' visual reasoning skills, their visual literacy, we didn't study critical thinking, and there are a whole bunch of other factors that we did not take into account. Again, this was an exploratory study. Give us ideas for what we want to do next. And then, of course, this was all low tech, wasn't it? I mean, when I teach first year level students, and I often teach students who enter the college with the lowest test scores. And when I pull out a protractor, they say, what's that? Right? Or some say, well, yeah, I think I used that like when I was in 5th grade or something, but I haven't seen one since. And of course, with good reason, right? We have all kinds of powerful tools. But again, for those of you who were at this morning's session, one of the other points that was made is sure, we have all these powerful tools, but in the wrong hands, these powerful tools can be very dangerous, can't they? Unless the user understands some fundamental ideas, what does it mean to have a fair scale? In what ways can a visual, in this case, a data visualization be deceptive? Unless students, people have that kind of background, these high-tech tools are dangerous in a sense. So that's an area for
The reason we didn't use the Excel or anything, the electronic technology, was based on my experience. I'm teaching instructional technology, and students use Excel. They more depending on the template. They didn't think about X, Y, or title on their own mind. So from the beginning, we said, let's just give the paper and pencil to measure their own thinking skills instead of relying on the template or default settings.
Did you ask the students before they started if they'd ever done a graph?
No, we did not. However, just to give you more of the context, this was, as I said, a summer program, And all of the instructors know one another and work very closely together in the summer program. So in fact, I knew that all the students had been studying. We did it about halfway through the summer. I knew that all of them had done some work with graphics.
Okay, okay, so they had,
Yeah, and of course, it's part of the standards in New Jersey, so if they had gone through
okay,
it.
that was
they-
the other question I
Yeah,
had is.
yeah, oh yeah, there's quite a
part of
bit
the
on
standard.
graphing, but again, most of it on interpretation, but some of it actually on construction. So they did all have some, at least,
Basic knowledge.
exactly, or had exposure, I guess is maybe the better term. I'm not sure if I would say basic knowledge, but at least exposure to some of the basic ideas of building and interpreting files. So, what other questions and comments do you have? Now that you've decided to come here instead of doing the baby tour
Leave the comic book guy.
and the comic, which, yeah.
I'm
It's still not shut.
curious, like, okay, I'm trying to process, what would have happened to your overall scores taking out the explanation criteria?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, and in fact, we're gonna have to try to answer that question now when we go back home, because we didn't think of it. Because that raises some very interesting questions, right? Because remember, the overall score was a mean, a non-weighted mean,
Right.
of those various components. And so what we can do, now that you've given us the idea, is to go back and take that out and see if in fact that makes a difference. Because you're right, that one is very different, isn't it? Because that one required not only
Right.
drawing the graph, but then interpreting it in a meaningful way and expressing that interpretation in written form.
Right.
Yeah,
And-
that's an excellent
and-
suggestion.
Typically, I mean, what I've seen with students, working with high school students heading off to college, is a lot of the standardized test scores evaluate their ability to read and write, whether it's a science test, a math test, whatever. And so I'm just curious if that would indeed make a difference. And I guess I'm wondering, like, what were the skills you were trying to, or thinking you would find were going to correlate with perseverance in college? Like what was your hypothesis? What did you think graph making has or contains in a kid other than reading, writing, and math?
Well, that-
Like,
that's
is
an
it
excellent
spatial
question, sure.
awareness? Is it, what is it?
Yeah,
Like,
well,
what is it?
besides the
Yeah.
so-called affective component, which is huge, just thinking about skills, certainly, well, the hypothesis is that visual reasoning skills would somehow be influencing the ability to build a graph at least as strongly as math skills.
Uh-huh.
So that was really, I think,
Yeah.
the sort of impetus for the study, that, otherwise, you're right, why look at this?
Yeah.
Why suspect that it's different?
From the literature review, we found that some said the graphing skill may be related to the other dimension, the visual spatial ability.
Right.
So, but other SAT doesn't really measure the visual
Right.
spatial abilities. So we try to connect maybe this one major. Maybe for the future study, we have found something, maybe using the Gardner's visual spatial ability
Right.
and then graph construction.
And maybe just that whole idea of the maturity involved in a synthesis type task maybe is not there, at that age level. I'm wondering, and linking it to GPA, so do we see a lot of other ideas of immaturity in a person heading off to college? So many people say maybe 18 is too young for someone to head off to college. That by the second year, their GPA is really a reflection of their maturity level, more so than their academic ability level.
Could be.
And so maybe the same is true, you know what I mean? I mean, it's just,
Absolutely,
I just
yeah.
think it's fascinating just to start thinking of the snowball effect that this could and might have
Yeah.
if you were to be able to replicate it again and look at things a little
Sure,
differently.
and of course, I also like to say that the thing that separates a high school senior from a college freshman is 3 months.
Yeah, really.
3 months without school.
Right, right, which means you're really going back to November of
Thank you,
the summer year.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
yeah.
So any of you, how about you guys thought, did you try the student build graphs?
Never used it.
Well, but I think what's interesting is, and without getting political here in any way, shape, or form, but with the Common Core state standards, of course, if indeed the idea is to have common standards nationally, so that, it's easier to have students transfer in and out, and all those things that the Common Core is supposed to be about. The tests that are linked to the Common Core right now in Ohio require the students to use digital tools very explicitly. And so, in some ways, the tests can sometimes, it can be said that the test is really measuring the student's ability to use digital tools and make those discerning choices about the tools, more so than actually showing evidence of their learning. And so is that indeed the same case with the graphs? When you were asking them to choose the most appropriate tool, that is a skill that we have to have our students practice often. There are all these tools out there now, hundreds and thousands of them, if you think about all the internet tools. So where does that curating come from? And are they being taught to curate? Just like as years and years and years as an English teacher and with the web and all that, you had to teach the kids to look at the sources and look at credible sources first. Well, the same is being true now of digital tools, which are fun and games and just nonsense, but which are really good tools that could and should in the 21st century be used. So I think it's a really great question. And it is a skill, that discerning skill of choosing what is most appropriate to the task. Now, these new tests do require the students to do that.
Right, and so to some extent, to sort of paraphrase one of the things you said, to some extent we're measuring what students have learned about navigating with various digital tools.
Right.
As
And
opposed
it'll
to-
take a year or two to get over that hump and standardized testing, the same way we did when kids had to fill in bubbles instead of, there were always errors based on just the prototype of the test.
What's interesting from a nursing perspective, we use the term critical thinking all the time. You look at the individual holistically, put all the pieces together after you do an assessment. Perseverance has been shown to be very critical, coming off of a comment that you made earlier, as far as a key indicator for success.
Right.
Even much more important than some of these others. So one of the things I find interesting with this graph concept, which is the first I've ever heard of it before, be interesting to see how many students would stick with it, given a particular set of instructions, using the creative aspect of their personality and knowledge base, the stick-to-itiveness to come up with something that meets the criteria that you gave them and helps them interpret it. I can see this task being frustrating for some, looking at what they did and saying, I don't get this, versus the set of students that will keep at it to come up with something, because that is a critical factor we have found with students in health. Those that stick with it and those that don't. Everything else being equal, or GPAs being even lower, it's the stick-to-itiveness in giving themselves time to finally get it. So it's another interesting tool in the toolkit to use with students. I'm impressed.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, and Jung, tell me if you agree, that I certainly was positively impressed in connection with your point, that when we looked at the data, it did not appear that many students just blew it off. And I was impressed particularly because we did not have any incentives. We essentially asked them, can you help us with our research project? No, no candies, no. And so it would have been very easy for us to do that. Here's my paper. And yet, we saw very little of that. So that was encouraging, because then of course, we knew at least there was some minimal level of tenacity there and stick-to-itness that we could rely on with these students. But you're absolutely right. I mean, that, if we could somehow measure that in a meaningful way, which I think is a big if, is this thing we call stick-to-itness, then it would be very interesting to see that kind of progression analysis, wouldn't it? And I bet that will come in first.
I wonder too if you even took the confine of asking them to use a graph out of the equation and just said, explain in a pictorial manner the population growth. What would you get? And with this whole conference being about visual literacy, again, saying to a kid, use a graph might have been confining, whereas if you just said, show it pictorially, what would they have done? Would they have drawn a cartoon? You know what I mean? And which would have been a good explanation. I don't know. So it's just, I think the whole concept of looking beyond the standardized math test and English test is a great concept of seeing what else leads to a kid either doing well or not doing well in post-secondary study.
In these days, the infographics and all those things, there's so much data visualization, actually, bubble chart, or chart. I mean, it's not quite related with this research, but just before I came here, we are talking about graphic class. And I asked students, how many of you look at what it means in the graph? Nobody raised hand. Anybody? Look at, you see the chart and graphs in the newspaper, magazines? Do you read it? How many of you?
Yeah, anecdotally, same thing. I often ask my students, when you're reading a magazine, and it has some kind of an image in it. I don't even necessarily say graph. Sometimes I will. How do you handle it? And a very large minority, 40% or so, will say, I don't even look at it. I just deal with words.
Yes. They look at it, but they don't
Or they
read
don't,
it.
they don't consciously look at it. Yeah, exactly.
register.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then when I showed just one graph kind of exaggerating the growth from last year to this year, and what do you think about this policy? Do you think this policy worked or not? I mean, it's about the traffic, depth of traffic, and it really decreased, kind of things from Tufte's book. And then it's, yes, it worked, because then, look at the lines, the number really decreased, so that policy really worked.
Yeah, without looking at the scale and realizing it was like a 2% reduction. Yeah. But again, there's a lot of research on those kinds of misunderstandings and understandings that students have in interpretation. There's quite a bit there. We were more interested, and again, I appreciate your comment and suggestion, but I think, at least speaking for myself now, I consciously wanted to restrict the domain to graphs. I thought that if we opened it up, that might not be the most appropriate entry point into this exploration. That it would maybe raise more questions than we can handle. And so I thought we could start here with a relatively narrow focus. Let's not talk about just use an image or something, but rather a graph. And then, of course, we can think about building out from there. Other comments or questions?
Do you have an opportunity to replicate the study? What are your plans?
Well, certainly we could do it locally, but then that doesn't address the criticism that we made earlier. Thank you. Of generalizability. And so we've had preliminary conversations, but we don't have any specific agreements with any other folks, and it, you know, it requires connections. People are willing to help out, and that takes some work. So nothing specific planned, other than doing something again in our
If you want to
university.
try your high school student.
That would be very interesting.
Yeah, that would be
Yes, yeah, if you consider it.
Well, and.
Yeah, if you can fit it in.
Right.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
know.
that's always,
Amongst all the
right,
others.
exactly. This
Well,
activity, I forget, I think you gave, because we did some pilot testing to see how long it would take. I think we ended up giving like a half hour. No, more than that, it was about 45 minutes. Well, actually, we gave an hour, but the typical student finished in about, I think it was 35, 40 minutes. Even less, I think it was less, but anyway, yeah, so, but it would take a whole class period. Yeah, just to do this part, right? Not to mention if we wanted to do an interpretation, yeah. But yeah, we're always looking for folks to help us out with that. And before I forget, I do have to make a shameless plug. I happen to also be the membership coordinator for the IVLA. And so if you're not already a member, please do realize that the IVLA has a lot to offer. We've had such a great collaboration with the folks here at the museum, and we're looking forward to inviting new folks to our fold. But the organization is a relatively small organization.
I've been a member since I'm the member for 25 years. I keep coming 25 years, since 1995, no, 20 years, yeah, 20 years. The reason I kept coming is the intimacy. I mean, you go to big conference.
This is not AERA, this is not, yeah, this is
But
much more
we
intimate.
find our colleagues interdisciplinary from different fields. I love this interdisciplinary. He's a math professor and
You didn't mention what you teach, did you?
instructional math.
Oh, you did? Oh, okay.
And
Yeah, and then we have
other-
someone in nursing education, we have,
high
we have
school
everything here,
teachers,
really. Exactly. You know, we have a high school teacher, and it's hard to find that kind of diversity in many professional organizations.
And then also very friendly together. So I love
Yeah.
this IVLA conference.
Yeah. So again, if you're interested, there's information at the registration desk.
I recruited him.
That's right.
Did you?
That's right.
My husband.
Yeah, we first had to get married though, that was the condition. I said, okay, I'll join if you marry
Sounds like
me.
a pretty good deal.
I find it interesting because being from a very small school, and I have 68 high school students. It's tiny.
Wow.
And our GPAs tend to be, in my mind, inflated because it's so small, but our SATs are very low. So it would be very interesting to actually have something like this to gauge, is it more of a predictor because our SATs low?
That's a good thing to try.
Yeah. And do you know roughly what percentage of your students go on to post-secondary?
We, of our 17 high schoolers, our senior class, we usually have every student accepted to college, and we probably only have 2 or 3 that do not. But we do tend to lose a lot in the first semester because of the,
Yeah.
what is the,
We see a lot go after the first semester.
yeah.
Yeah, it's endemic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We
And
at
again,
the University
so
of
many-
Toledo, I mean, you just have to have a high school degree.
Oh, it's
Yeah,
open?
Yeah, it's an open
Oh.
enrollment. So when I get beginning students in art history, it is sometimes
All
really
over.
frightening. Yeah, because you have kids at all different kinds of levels, from honors students to
Yeah.
kids who basically really have difficulties reading and writing. And to me, it's very, but what you just said about them not even looking at images really helps me understand why you sit there and you know, you feel like doing jumping jacks or something to try and get them to look at images.
Yeah. And how much time and energy do designers spend on all of
I
these
know.
questions?
I know.
And the consumer's not even looking at it.
Exactly, exactly.
They are looking at it and then.
Well, or they're
Or just
glancing
glazing
at it,
over it,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
And of course, glazing over it can be ideal, right? If you want to send a specific message, you know, the example that Jung gave with the distorted graph, isn't that wonderful how I'm scanning the page and I'm unconsciously consuming
Yes,
this,
making an
and I'm
assumption.
looking at a steeply
Yeah.
declining curve, and I didn't look at the scale. And so it's doing the job, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, keep up that good work.
yeah. Being an educator and a parent of a son who is in his sophomore year of college, I kind of lived through this whole perseverance and readiness, and I think more has to do with really maturity of thought than ability level in persevering through that first and the second year of college. I really do. And so I think as educators, we have to find ways to bridge that gap. You know, we've talked for many years about the gap in preschool to kindergarten and middle school to high school. And we just kind of assume that as kids hit 18 and they graduate from high school, that the ones who can will make it, and the ones who can't won't, and they'll go off and do something else. And not realizing that I think we
takes
can
time,
do a
yeah.
lot as educators to build that readiness factor. And that's really, really important.
Sure, sure. And again, to get back to your previous comment about Common Core, state standards and
Yeah.
assessment, of course, there's a hope that that will result in some positive change, but at the same time, we know that there are some inherent limitations.
Sure.
The kind, you know, just setting standards alone without
Yeah.
providing resources for teachers to implement those standards may have less success than we hope.
Yeah.
But there's always hope.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much for
Thank you.
choosing us over. Thank you.